Welcome, viewers. Today, we drift into a world history often romanticizes, but rarely understands, a time of polished manners, silent streets, lantern-lit nights, and elegant fashion, but behind that shining image lies a darker reality, one that no textbook or movie fully tells. Tonight, we open the door to the forgotten side of the Victorian era, not the grand mansions or the wealthy elite, but the broken, starving, struggling lives of ordinary rural people who lived and died in the shadows. Their lives were not beautiful, their days were not gentle, their world was not the dream we imagine. So sit back, listen carefully, and prepare yourself, because this is the truth of how the rural poor really lived, and how history quietly hid their suffering. When people speak of the Victorian age, their voices soften with admiration. It is remembered as a time of manners, elegance, and refinement. The world imagines glittering ballrooms, silk gowns sweeping across polished marble floors, servants carrying silver trays of wine, and gentlemen tipping their hats while ladies whisper behind painted fans. History books, movies, and literature have created a shining picture of this era, as if every street smelled of roses and every person lived a life touched by grace. The wealthy did everything they could to make sure this illusion survived. The newspapers wrote about queenly ceremonies, royal marriages, grand inventions, and society parties where chandeliers glowed like falling stars. But that polished surface was a mask. Behind it, hidden from the history lessons taught in schools, lived millions of forgotten people, men, women, and children whose suffering formed the foundation on which this glamorous world stood. The truth is simple. Victorian beauty existed because millions of others lived through Victorian misery. Far from the cities, deep in the countryside, life was nothing like the paintings and stories people romanticize today. The countryside seems peaceful to modern eyes. Endless fields, quiet paths, farms surrounded by rolling hills and fresh green landscapes. But during the 1800s, for the rural poor, it was not peaceful and it was not gentle. It was a battlefield without gunfire, a place where survival depended not on fortune, but on relentless labor and endless sacrifice. Every sunrise brought fear, fear of hunger, fear of sickness, fear of losing children, fear of failing crops, and fear of death. The countryside did not promise life. It demanded it. A rural Victorian home was not a cozy farmhouse with wooden floors and warm fireplaces like the ones seen in movies. Most were crude huts made from rotting wood, cold stone, or packed earth. The roofs were patched with straw, mud, or whatever could be found, and yet the rain always found its way through. In winter, icy winds slipped through holes in the walls, freezing families as they slept side by side for warmth. In summer, heat baked the tiny rooms until breathing felt heavy and suffocating. The floor was dirt, packed hard by feet, animals, and time. When it rained, mud crept inside. When it was dry, dust settled over everything: the bed, the food, the children. There were no blankets of comfort. Most people slept on straw that grew mold and filled with insects. The smell of smoke from indoor cooking fires filled every corner day and night, because chimneys were luxury. Smoke had no place to escape except through thin walls or broken windows. Families coughed constantly, babies wheezed, old people choked on the thick air, but there was no escape. Opening the door meant freezing winds, and keeping it closed meant suffocating smoke. The rural poor had no choice but to breathe their sickness in and breathe their strength out. Rats and mice lived in the walls, floors, and corners of these huts. They chewed through sacks of grain, stole crumbs of bread, and left waste everywhere. Fleas bit through skin, clothes were never fully clean, parasites spread through families as easily as breath. Many farmers lived with their livestock, sheep, goats, chickens, because there was no other place to keep them safe from thieves, wolves, or starvation. The animals slept just feet away from where children lay their heads, and every day began with the smell of manure rising into the morning air. These were not isolated stories of misfortune. This was common life. The countryside was ruled by the wealthy landowners who owned nearly everything: the soil, the crops, the livestock, the houses, and even the labor of the poor. Men, women, and children worked from before sunrise to long after sunset. Their backs bent, their hands cracked open, their skin darkened from sunlight and wind, their bodies aged before their time. A man of 40 often looked 60. A woman of 30 sometimes looked 50. Life carved its marks into their faces and bones. The work was endless. Fields had to be plowed by hand or with war, now tools. Seeds had to be planted one by one. Crops had to be watered, weeded, protected from animals, and harvested. Every task was slow, exhausting, and unforgiving. A single mistake could ruin a season. A sudden storm could destroy weeks of labor. Too much rain meant rot. Too little rain meant dust. Frost could kill crops overnight. Disease could wipe out entire harvests. Victorian society did not care. If the crops failed, it was the poor who starved. If sickness came, it was the poor who died. No laws protected them. No safety nets existed. Rural families lived at the mercy of nature and the cruelty of those who owned their land. Most workers earned just enough to survive, barely. A family's meal often consisted of cold bread, potatoes, and whatever vegetables could be grown behind the house. Butter, fruit, eggs, and milk were sold for money instead of eaten. Meat was rare. Sugar was a luxury. Tea was treasured like gold, sipped slowly, stretched for days. Hunger was not a moment in life. It was life itself. Children learned to suffer young. A child who could walk could work. Their tiny hands picked stones from soil, collected firewood, carried buckets of water heavier than their bodies. They did not go to school. Schools cost money, shoes cost money, books cost money, childhood cost money, and the poor had none. So children worked, grew older fast, and became exhausted before they ever learned to read or write. Many never learned their own birthday. Many could not sign their own name. Poverty did not only starve the body, it starved the mind. Every Sunday, the church bells rang. The wealthy sat in polished pews, wearing fine clothes, whispering prayers, and thanking God for their comfortable lives. The poor entered in silence, covered in dirt and war, knout rags. They sat in the back, separated from the people who controlled their fate. They were told to be grateful. They were told that suffering was normal. They were told that God made the rich to rule and the poor to obey. Religion was used to bend their backs lower. Most rural families lived in constant debt to landlords, millers, and shopkeepers. Farmers rarely used money. They paid bills with crops. If the crops failed, their debt grew. If debt grew too large, their animals, land, and tools could be taken away. Many families lost everything and became wanderers, sleeping in barns, begging for food, walking from village to village, searching for work. They were treated like pests, not people. There was no dignity in poverty. Society believed that the poor deserved their suffering. The wealthy wrote laws to protect themselves and ignored the screams of those beneath them. A well-fed man could pass a starving child in the street and feel nothing. Starvation was common, regular, expected. When someone died from hunger or sickness, no one was surprised. Even those who tried to escape poverty found only new forms of misery. Some walked long distances to cities hoping for factory work, but cities had their own nightmares. Slums filled with filth, crowded housing, polluted air, children dying in streets, and dangerous machines that took arms, fingers, and lives. If the countryside was a slow death, the cities were a fast one. Many people believed they had nowhere in the world where they could live with dignity. The wealth of the Victorian world was built directly on the suffering of the poor. The rich decorated their homes with furniture carved from wood taken from forests cleared by starving laborers. Their silk gowns were sewn by children. Their candles were made from wax collected by workers who breathed smoke and poison. Their jewels came from mines where men died in darkness. Their luxury was not silent, it screamed, but society pretended not to hear. Visitors from other countries wrote stories about the beauty of Victoria's England, but rarely traveled into the villages where families lived in rotting cottages. Pain was invisible to those who never felt it. In the countryside, the sound of laughter was rare. The sound of hunger was everywhere. The growling stomach, the crying child, the defeated mother, the exhausted father, and the silence that filled homes when food was gone. Disease struck often. Plagues moved through villages silently and killed without mercy. One sick cow could ruin a family. One infected person could ruin an entire community. Parents buried child after child, yet were expected to rise the next morning and work again. Some families had 10 children, not because they wanted large families, but because half of them were expected to die. Life was uncertain. Death was close. The graveyard grew faster than crops. Through all this suffering, the wealthy told themselves that the poor were lazy. They believed poverty was punishment for failure. They believed that those who worked the hardest deserved the least. It was easier to judge than to care. It was easier to turn away than to help. They gave charity only when people starved in the streets, and even then, charity was offered with shame. People who asked for help were treated like criminals, but the poor were not criminals. They were victims of a system designed to crush them from birth to death. As time passed, rural life became even harder. New farming machines appeared, but only the wealthy could afford them. Machines replaced workers. Families who had survived generations in the countryside suddenly became useless. Landowners pushed them out, tore down their homes, and used their fields for profit. Villages emptied, some became ghost towns, others became slave camps of work, ruled by landlords who cared only for money. In paintings, the Victorian world appears beautiful. In reality, the beauty was stained with the blood, sweat, and tears of the forgotten millions who lived in the countryside. The history books talk about progress, but progress did not feed hungry children. Progress did not save dying mothers. Progress did not repair hearts that broke quietly in dark, cold rooms. To this day, many believe the Victorian age was golden. They forget that gold always shines brightest when held above the ones who mine it. Behind every shining ballroom was a starving family. Behind every banquet was a table with no bread. Behind every fine suit was a child whose hands bled while sewing it. The Victorian age was not only an age of elegance. It was an age of suffering, and no one suffered more silently, more painfully, or more forgotten than the rural poor. Life for Victorian farming families was not measured in days or months, but in seasons. Spring, summer, autumn, and winter, each season demanded sacrifice, and each season carried its own dangers. There was no rest, no pause, no moment where the poor could breathe and feel safe. The earth was both their master and their enemy, and it did not care who lived or who starved. Sunrise was their alarm, and sunset was not the end of the day, only the beginning of exhaustion. When the world slept, farmers still worked. When the world celebrated, farmers still worked. The soil owned them, and every breath they took was borrowed. Fields stretched across the countryside like endless oceans of green and brown, beautiful from a distance but brutal up close. The soil was hard, heavy, and unforgiving. Plowing it meant pushing iron through rock and roots, often with bare hands or tools that barely worked. Horses and oxen were expensive. Most families could not afford them. The poor used their own bodies as machines. Men dug furrows until their backs screamed in pain and their fingers bled. Women followed behind, dropping seeds one by one, bending until their spines seemed as if they were breaking. Children carried water in buckets heavier than their small bodies. A day in the fields could last 15 hours, sometimes more. There were no weekends. There were no holidays. The earth did not take days off, so neither could they. It was said that farmers lived with the sun. When the first light touched the horizon, they were already awake. Before a meal, before a prayer, before speaking a word, they went to the fields. In the biting cold of early mornings, their breath rose like smoke, though fires were rare. They could not waste wood. In the heat of summer, their skin burned and peeled beneath the sun. There was no shade, no comfort, no place to escape the hard labor. Sweat soaked their clothes until they clung to the skin like wet rags. Flies swarmed, mud sucked at their boots. Blisters cracked open and never fully healed. Farming was not heroic. It was painful. It was endless. And it rarely fed the people who worked the land. Most families did not own the fields they labored in. The land belonged to wealthy landlords who lived far away in mansions, in cities, in large estates hidden behind iron gates. Some landlords had never even stepped foot on the farms they owned. They did not know the faces of the men who worked for them, or the names of the children who starved under their rule. They did not care. They wanted crops, profit, and power. The farmers could break their backs, lose children to sickness, bury loved ones in cold ground. It made no difference. Rent had to be paid. The landlords never forgave debt. Families kept working because the alternative was unthinkable. If they could not pay rent, they could be thrown out of their homes and left to wander the roads. Homelessness meant death. There were no shelters, no government to offer help, no laws to protect them. So they worked. They tightened their belts, their stomachs, their hearts, and they worked. The food they grew, wheat, barley, oats, vegetables, and livestock, should have fed them, but it didn't. Much of it went straight to their landlords. Whatever remained had to be sold to buy salt, flour, soap, or candles. If they kept too much food for themselves, landlords claimed they were stealing. They could be punished, jailed, or expelled. Imagine harvesting a field of potatoes, thousands of them, and still going home hungry. Imagine cooking a meal for someone else while your own children cry from hunger. That was the life of rural Victorians. Their diet was simple, plain, and repetitive. Bread made from coarse flour, hard potatoes cooked in ash or water, sometimes boiled turnips or cabbage if the garden had survived insects and frost. Butter was precious, milk was precious, eggs were valuable. If they had chickens, the eggs were sold for coins. If they had cows, the milk was given to the landlord or sold at market. Most of what they grew left their own tables. Many families drank nothing but weak tea or water that was dirty and cold from the well. Salted meat was rare and eaten only on special occasions. Fresh meat was a treasure. Children could go months without tasting it. Hunger was constant. It was a quiet predator that lived inside every home. Mothers learned to lie to their children, pretending they had already eaten, so the little ones could have more. Fathers cut smaller portions for themselves to hide their starvation. Teenagers grew thin and pale instead of strong and tall. Their bones became visible beneath their skin. Their eyes sank deeper. Their bodies were weak, yet they had to keep working. Hunger did not excuse anyone from labor. A good harvest meant survival. A bad harvest meant disaster. If rain came at the wrong time, the crops could rot. If rain did not come at all, the crops would dry out and die. No one could control insects, mold, or disease. A single storm could ruin a season of work in one night. Imagine watching black clouds gather and knowing that the wind and rain could destroy everything you needed to live. When crops failed, villagers prayed. They pleaded with God. They begged the sky to stop raining, to start raining, to save them. But the sky did not listen. When the harvest was ruined, there was no backup plan, no emergency storehouses, no government aid. Starvation crept into cottages like a silent thief. Children went to sleep crying. Fathers searched for work in other villages, walking miles until their feet blistered and bled. Mothers fed their babies water because there was no milk left in their bodies. Some families dug up roots in the forest or caught rats to eat. Some stole food and were punished like criminals. Others swallowed their pride and begged in the streets. The struggle did not end when crops were harvested and stored. Farming was dangerous. Tools were sharp. Animals were powerful. Fire was always a threat. A slip of a sickle could slice into flesh. A fall from a horse could break bones. A wound could become infected and deadly. There were no hospitals. There were no doctors for the poor. If someone was severely injured, the family's only hope was prayer. Many died from accidents that would be treatable today with bandages and medicine. Nature was merciless, but society was crueler. The wealthy held balls, banquets, and dinners where tables overflowed with meat, pies, fruits, sweets, and wine. Servants threw away more food in one night than a poor family could eat in a week. Farmers delivered food to their mansions and returned home to empty plates. They carried bread to the rich and returned to their huts to eat scraps. They slaughtered animals for wealthy feasts, but could not afford meat for their own children. Their work fed everyone but themselves. Children in farming families suffered most of all. Childhood, as we understand it today, barely existed. Instead of toys, they held farming tools. Instead of schoolbooks, they carried baskets of potatoes. Instead of running and playing, they dragged heavy buckets of water from wells. Their hands blistered, their feet cracked, their backs bent under weight. A 5-year-old child could spend 10 hours a day in the fields. A 7-year-old could work alongside grown men. There was no laughter during harvest season, only exhaustion. A child who grew tired was beaten or yelled at. A child who fell behind was reminded that food depended on their speed. Their tiny bodies were forced into adulthood long before their minds understood what life was. And if a child died, whether from hunger, disease, exhaustion, or accident, work continued the next day. Grief could not stop survival. Tears could not replace crops. The pain of parents was buried under the weight of necessity, but the numbness never erased the guilt. Many mothers spent their lives believing they failed their children. Many fathers carried shame like a scar on their hearts, but in truth, they were victims of a world that demanded everything and returned nothing. Seasons ruled their emotions. Spring brought hope, summer brought exhaustion, autumn brought fear, and winter brought despair. Winter especially was a season of death. With no crops growing, families tried to survive on whatever they had stored, but stores were small, food disappeared fast, cold seeped through the walls and floors. Fires burned low because wood was scarce. Ice formed inside houses. People slept fully clothed, pressed together like animals, shivering through the night. Some froze to death in their sleep. Others weakened slowly, losing strength until they could no longer stand. The cold brought sickness, and sickness brought death. Colds turned into pneumonia, fevers turned into delirium, coughs filled the air. One sick child could infect an entire family. Mothers prayed for spring not because they loved the warmth, but because it saved lives. If the weather was harsh for too long, entire villages faced starvation. Bread shrank to crumbs. Meals became memories. Fathers hunted for rabbits and came home with nothing. Mothers boiled bones just to make water taste like soup. Children cried themselves to sleep with empty stomachs. Grandparents gave up their share so the young could survive. Some families burned furniture to stay warm. Others ripped apart their own roofs for firewood. Winter took more lives than any war. Yet when spring finally arrived, the farmers returned to the fields, broken but alive. They planted again. They hoped again. They prayed again. The cycle repeated year after year, generation after generation. Every farmer believed that if they worked hard enough, they might one day escape poverty. But the truth was cruel. The system was designed to keep them poor forever. Landowners controlled the soil. Merchants controlled the prices. Moneylenders controlled debts. Even if a family had a good harvest and managed to save a little, disaster always returned. A sick cow, a failed crop, a harsh winter, a sudden tax, any misfortune could destroy them. Some families dreamed of owning their own land, but that dream was almost impossible. Land was expensive. The poor could work for decades and never save enough. Even when land was available for sale, landlords bought it first. The rich grew richer, the poor stayed poor. The suffering of farming families was hidden from history because the wealthy believed it was natural. They saw farmers as tools. Tools were not meant to be comfortable. Tools did not need joy, rest, or hope. Tools existed to be used until they broke, but behind the suffering there was still humanity. Farmers formed close communities. Neighbors helped each other when they could. Women shared bread when one family ran out. Men repaired roofs together. Children looked after younger siblings. People told stories at night to forget hunger. They sang songs while working to soothe their pain. They found small moments of joy, flowers in spring, a fresh loaf of bread, a baby's first laugh, the warmth of the sun after a long winter. Silence was filled with whispers of hope. Hope was their only wealth. And yet, the world outside their villages had no idea they suffered. Newspapers praised the achievements of the Victorian age, railways, factories, scientific discoveries, new inventions, but they never spoke of the hands that built those achievements. If the rural poor disappeared, the entire empire would fall. Their work fed the cities, powered the industries, raised the livestock, and harvested the crops. They were the backbone of the nation, but the nation never thanked them. Even today, when people imagine the Victorian era, they think of fancy clothes, beautiful dances, and shining cities. They rarely think of hollow eyes, cracked hands, empty bowls, and starving children. But that was the true foundation of Victorian society, not gold, but sweat, not silk, but dirt, not luxury, but human suffering. The fields were not green with prosperity. They were watered with tears, blood, and sacrifice. And through it all, farming families endured. They endured pain that modern society could never understand. They endured hunger that never left. They endured cold that froze the soul. They endured loss, grief, and heartbreak. They endured because they had no choice. This was not a life chosen. This was a life forced upon them. And in the quiet corners of the countryside, where the world did not look, history's forgotten millions lived and died beneath a sky that never noticed their suffering. The deeper you look into rural Victorian life, the more you realize that suffering was not an exception. It was the daily soundtrack of existence. Hunger was not a sudden crisis. It was a permanent resident in people's stomachs. Every day began with scarcity. The sun rose over fields that promised work, but not survival. The people who lived in these villages were not dreaming of wealth or comfort. Most were simply fighting to stay alive until the next morning. For families living on farms and tiny hamlets scattered across the countryside, there was rarely a guarantee of food. If crops failed, they starved. If wages dropped, they starved. If illness arrived, they starved faster. Many had no land of their own. They worked on someone else's fields, growing wheat, potatoes, barley, or hay that they didn't get to eat. Their payment was never good enough to feed a family properly. It burned inside them, knowing that their hands grew food for the wealthy, yet their children went to sleep on empty stomachs. Meals were not meals. Breakfast was often just stale bread dipped in weak tea, and sometimes there was not even tea, just water. Thick slices of bread, hard as a brick, were softened by soaking them. The bread was not fluffy, not soft, not warm. It was cheap, rough, and packed with impurities. Flour was often mixed with chalk or sawdust by dishonest bakers who wanted to make more profit. People knew it was bad. They joked bitterly that their bread tasted like the floor, But when you are starving, you do not argue with the taste of survival. Potatoes were a luxury, meat was a miracle. Eggs were rare, milk was often watered down. Children sat on cold floors licking the last drops from empty bowls, while their parents pretended they were full. Hunger made people quiet. It made them angry. It made them hopeless. To survive, many families turned to what was known as the poor man's feast: bread, onions, and salt. On good days, maybe a greasy piece of bacon fat, not meat, just the fat, rubbed along the pan to give flavor to the potatoes. People hung that same piece of bacon over the stove for days, sometimes weeks, scraping the smallest sliver off each night so it would last. The smell filled the kitchen more than the taste filled anyone's stomach. Children learned to eat slowly, not to enjoy the food, but so that their mind could pretend that the meal was bigger than it was. When a potato was shared among 5 siblings, each bite had to stretch. Mothers broke bread into tiny crumbs so the youngest would think they had more. Fathers handed over their portion without hesitation, claiming they had eaten earlier or weren't hungry. Everyone knew they were lying. Worse than hunger was the guilt that came with it. Parents watched their children's stomachs swell from malnutrition. They saw bones poking through skin. They saw eyes that once sparkled turn dull and sunken. Babies cried until they lost the strength to cry at all. And when a child died from starvation, no one talked about it loudly. It became another silent tragedy in a village full of silent tragedies. Diseases flourished in weakened bodies. Typhus, cholera, dysentery, tuberculosis illness was always waiting. Medicine was a distant dream. Doctors cost money that no one had. When a child developed a fever or began coughing blood, most families had only one treatment: prayer. Some brewed makeshift remedies, herbs, roots, boiled leaves. But without nutrition, without warmth, without clean water, the body seldom recovered. And what killed many wasn't the disease itself. It was the conditions that made disease inevitable. Water came from streams that animals walked through, urinated in, or died in. Wells became contaminated. People drank what they had, knowing it could kill them. It was a choice between thirst and poison. Villagers boiled water whenever they could, but they didn't have enough fuel to boil every drop. Firewood was precious and often stolen in the dark from the edges of forests. Getting caught meant punishment, fines, or being dragged before a landowner like a criminal. Soap was expensive. Clean clothes were rare. Cold weather meant wet garments that never fully dried. Children shivered through winter nights wrapped in thin, frayed sheets. Beds were stuffed with straw that turned moldy. Rats and insects shared the blankets. Fleas feasted on sleeping bodies. Lice lived in hair and clothing. People scratched until their skin bled. Small infections became deadly wounds. A tiny cut from farm tools could lead to gangrene. Without proper treatment, a simple blister could cost someone a hand, a foot, or their life. Inside the cottages and laborers' huts, smells told the story of poverty: damp air, rot, sweat, sickness, smoke from bad coal, unwashed bodies. Many homes lacked chimneys, so smoke filled the rooms. Soot blackened the walls. Children developed chronic coughs. The elderly suffocated slowly. In some houses, the roof leaked every time it rained. Families placed pots everywhere to catch the water. When the pots overflowed, the floor turned to mud, and still they slept there because there was nowhere else to go. To keep warm in winter, families burned anything that would catch fire: broken furniture, old boots, dried cow dung, scraps of wood, even bits of rubbish. The smoke was toxic, but the cold was worse. Fingers went numb. Frostbite kissed toes and ears. People went to bed not knowing if they would wake up. Some froze in their sleep. Others deliberately kept moving all night, afraid that stopping meant death. Food shortages became famine, and famine turned villages into desperate places. Men walked miles searching for work. Women begged outside markets. Children stood barefoot in mud, holding out their hands for scraps. Some stole, some were caught. Punishments were brutal. Public beatings, imprisonment, or worse, transportation. A starving child could be shipped to the colonies for stealing bread. A mother could be jailed for taking potatoes left in the dirt. The law did not forgive hunger. Even when there was work, it was brutal. Laborers worked from sunrise to sunset for pennies. Their bodies were tools, used, worn, and discarded. Farmhands carried heavy sacks, dug trenches, harvested crops, cut wood, mended fences. Their backs bent. Their arms ached, hands filled with cuts, splinters, and blisters. The elderly worked until they collapsed, because rest was a luxury only the wealthy could afford. Women worked harder than anyone. They cooked, cleaned, washed clothes by hand in freezing water, tended gardens, milked animals, gathered firewood, patched clothes, and watched over children. When their husbands brought home tiny wages, women stretched every coin, every meal, every scrap. They were the silent warriors of poverty. Many died young from exhaustion, childbirth, or untreated illness, but their suffering rarely appeared in history books. Their names vanished as if they never existed. Children were not spared. From as young as 5 or 6, they worked in fields, factories, or mines. Some crawled under machinery too small for adults. Some carried coal in baskets larger than their bodies. Some worked with chemicals that burned their skin and poisoned their lungs. Childhood was not a time of learning and play. It was a time of labor and pain. Many never learned to read or write because school was a luxury. Survival came first, education came last, and when children finally returned home at night, their parents saw shoulders slumped, eyes half closed, legs trembling. They were not children, they were miniature adults, aged by suffering. Many died before reaching adulthood. Those who lived often carried permanent injuries, twisted backs, damaged lungs, missing fingers. Their dreams were buried long before they were. At the heart of all this was a cruel truth. The people who fed the nation could not feed themselves. They worked the land, but the land was not theirs. They produced food, yet their own tables were bare. The wealthy landowners, the aristocrats, the merchants. They enjoyed full plates, warm beds, clean homes, and fancy clothes. They hosted dinners with roasted meats, rich puddings, wine, and bread that never tasted of chalk or dust. Their wastebasket had more food than a rural family might see in an entire week. And still, the poor were told that they were lazy, that they were failures, that God wanted them to suffer. Poverty was treated as a personal flaw, not a broken system. Anyone who asked for help was labeled shameful, weak, or immoral. To survive, many families accepted charity and handouts from churches or wealthy patrons. But charity came with humiliation. People lined up in front of parish doors, begging for old bread, leftover soup, or small coins. They bowed their heads, ashamed, as if hunger were a sin. Some were forced to attend public hearings in the parish house, where officials judged whether they deserved help. They called these places poor law bastilles because they felt like prisons of shame. When help was denied, which happened often, desperation drove people into the darkest corners of survival. Some scavenged in dung heaps for dropped grains. Some searched fields at night for forgotten crops. Children stole carrots from gardens, apples from orchards, coal from wagons, anything to keep their families alive. Some sold personal items, blankets, tools, clothing, until nothing was left. And when there was truly nothing more to sell except their own bodies, women and girls sometimes turned to prostitution, not by choice, but because starvation leaves no room for morality. Throughout all this suffering, there was another torment, the fear of the workhouse. For Victorians, the workhouse was not just a building. It was the last stop before death and the worst humiliation a poor family could endure. Everyone knew that entering the workhouse meant losing your freedom, your dignity, your family, and sometimes your life. It was a place where the poor went not to be helped, but to be punished for being poor. Families avoided it at all costs. They would rather starve at home than be fed in the workhouse. Husbands and wives were separated upon entry. Parents were separated from children. People were numbered, not named. They wore uniforms, marched in silence, and worked like prisoners. Food was intentionally disgusting, so no one would choose to stay. Conditions were designed to crush the spirit, to break the will, to remind the poor that their suffering was their own fault. Rural Victorians lived with the constant shadow of this threat. One lost job, one failed harvest, one illness, and the workhouse became a terrifying possibility. It was a weapon used against them, a warning that poverty was a crime. Even religion offered no escape. Many preachers told the poor that suffering was holy, that it was God's punishment or God's test. Some believed it, and it brought them comfort. Others felt betrayed, that both God and society had abandoned them. Churches gave charity, but often with judgment. People were scolded for being poor, questioned about their morals, and treated like burdens. And yet, despite everything, hunger, disease, cruelty, humiliation, rural Victorians kept going. They planted seeds even when they doubted they would live to harvest them. They patched roofs, knowing the next storm would rip them apart again. They held weddings, christenings, and tiny moments of joy. A loaf of fresh bread, a born child who lived past infancy, a night without coughing or hunger. These were victories. In the evenings, after a day of brutal work, people told stories by candlelight or fire. They sang songs, shared folklore, whispered legends of ghosts and spirits roaming the fields. These stories gave them a reason to laugh, or at least a reason to forget, if only for a few minutes. Hope was fragile, but it existed. It existed in the eyes of a mother holding her newborn, whispering that maybe this child would have a better life. It existed in young lovers dreaming of a small cottage of their own. It existed in the belief that someday, somehow, things would change. But change was slow and suffering was fast. For most rural Victorians, life was not a path toward progress or wealth. It was a cycle of struggle, repeated generation after generation. The landowners gained, the workers suffered, and history barely remembered their names. Their lives were rotten, not because they were weak, but because the world they lived in was designed that way. It was built on inequality, cruelty, and indifference. The countryside looked peaceful and beautiful from a distance, green fields, rolling hills, gentle streams. But if you stepped closer, you would see the truth. Behind every picturesque landscape was a story of hunger, pain, and silent endurance. These were the forgotten people, the unseen majority, the ones who kept the nation alive, even as the nation let them starve. If there was one thing that defined the suffering of rural Victorians more than hunger or disease, it was the harsh, merciless reality of work. Work was not a source of dignity or hope. It was a slow crushing of the body and soul. Men, women, and even children were trapped in a world where labor meant survival, punishment, and slow destruction all at once. There were no weekends, no rest days, no 8-hour shifts. Life itself was the shift. You worked until your hands bled, until your knees gave out, until you collapsed. Then you woke up and did it again. For most rural Victorians, employment was unpredictable. You were not hired permanently. You were hired by the day, sometimes by the hour. If there was no work one morning, there was no food that night. Men woke before sunrise and dragged themselves across muddy fields, hoping a farmer or landowner needed extra hands. Sometimes a dozen men waited outside a barn or gate, and only 2 were chosen. The rest walked home with empty pockets, trying to hide their shame from their families. A man without work felt like a ghost, present yet powerless. When work was found, it was brutal. The agricultural laborer's life was a cycle of digging, lifting, planting, chopping, cutting, hauling, pushing, pulling, sweating, shivering, bleeding, and enduring. In summer, the sun burned skin until it blistered. In winter, frost turned fingers purple and numb. The wind sliced through clothing like knives. When it rained, the earth turned into a pit of cold mud that swallowed boots and soaked through every layer of fabric. Men marched on anyway because stopping meant hunger. Farmhands moved stones, cleared fields, planted hedges, repaired fences, dug ditches, and harvested crops. Their hands were scarred, thick, calloused, a physical map of pain. Many could barely straighten their fingers at night. Their backs bent permanently from lifting sacks heavier than their own bodies. Tools were crude. Safety meant nothing. If you cut yourself or smashed a finger under a plow, you wrapped it in dirty cloth and kept going. Missing work for a single day could mean losing your job forever. The wealthy landowners who hired them rarely spoke to them. Orders were shouted, not explained. The workers were not people. They were tools. Replaceable, forgettable, invisible. If a man grew too old or too injured to work, he was tossed aside like broken equipment. No pension, no assistance, just hunger and slow decline. Women's work was no gentler. Most people imagine Victorian women sitting in warm kitchens sewing or baking bread, but that picture belonged only to the wealthy. Rural women were labor machines. They worked from before dawn until long after sunset. They cooked, cleaned, fetched water from distant wells, gathered firewood, washed clothing in icy streams, scrubbed floors, fed chickens, milked cows, churned butter, tended gardens, and cared for children. If their husbands worked in fields, many women worked alongside them, doing the same tasks for even less pay. There was no rest during pregnancy, no maternity care, no protection. A woman could be bent over washing clothes on the morning she went into labor. Some gave birth at home with no doctor, no midwife, only neighbors or family. Many stood up after delivering a child and went back to work. Those who didn't risked losing their jobs. Their bodies were exhausted, their bones weakened by malnutrition. Yet society still expected them to be silent, obedient, and grateful. And after childbirth came another risk, losing the baby. Many newborns did not survive their first days or weeks. Their lungs were weak, their bodies underfed, their homes cold and damp. Mothers buried tiny coffins in churchyards so often that grief became routine, but the world paid them no attention. Rural women lived with constant pain, physical, emotional, and unseen. The most tragic victims of Victorian labor were children. Childhood, as we understand it today, did not exist. A child was not someone to educate, protect, or cherish. A child was extra labor, extra income, extra survival. Boys and girls as young as 5 worked in fields. Some chased birds away from crops for long hours with no shoes and no coat. Others picked stones from soil or carried buckets of water larger than their arms. Their feet were torn by thorns, their skin cut by cold wind, their hands cracked and bleeding. But farm work was not the worst fate. Many rural children were sent to factories, mills, mines, or brickyards. Their small size made them perfect for dangerous jobs. They crawled under machines, climbed inside chimneys, cleaned gears while they were still moving. They breathed dust, smoke, and toxic chemicals every day. Many were maimed or killed. The newspapers printed occasional horror stories of children crushed by machines, drowned in quarries, suffocated in chimneys, but only when the story was sensational enough to shock the wealthy. Most deaths were never recorded. For these children, school was a fantasy, literacy was rare, many could not write their own names, some did not even know their exact age, their bodies suffered permanent damage, spines twisted, lungs blackened, bones deformed. By the time they reached adulthood, they were already broken. Life had stolen their youth before they ever knew they had one, and all this suffering was justified with one cruel idea. Poverty was the fault of the poor. If you were starving, it was because you were lazy. If you could not find work, it was because you were worthless. The wealthy believed they were superior, not just in money, but in character and morality. They saw the rural poor as a lower species, meant to labor and die quietly. The class divide was clearer in the countryside than anywhere else. The rich lived in large houses with gardens, servants, and prized horses. Their children ate meat, drank milk, owned books, and slept on soft mattresses. They played, laughed, learned, and dreamed. They had birthdays and toys and tutors. Their futures were bright. Meanwhile, the rural poor lived in crumbling cottages with leaking roofs, dirt floors, and crowded beds. Their children shared torn clothing and one pair of shoes, if they had shoes at all. They ate what was left, if anything was left. They grew old before they grew tall. Some workers lived in tied cottages, houses owned by their employer. On the surface, this seemed like a blessing, a home provided by work, but it was a trap. If a man lost his job, he lost his house the same day. His family was thrown out onto the road with nowhere to go. Landowners used this power as a weapon. If a worker complained, asked for higher wages, or refused unsafe tasks, the landlord could evict them. Silence and obedience were the only protections the poor had. Religion was used to control them too. Priests preached that hard work, suffering, and obedience were holy. The poor were told that God rewarded patience in heaven, not on earth. Many believed it because hope was the only comfort they could afford. Others saw the hypocrisy and felt anger boiling in their hearts. If God cared, why were innocent children starving? Why were mothers burying babies? Why did the rich live in luxury while the poor wasted away? Some men turned to alcohol, not for pleasure, but as escape. Gin and ale dulled the hunger, the pain, the hopelessness. It made the world quiet for a few hours, but alcohol brought other dangers. Money spent on drink meant less food for the family. Some men became violent, some lost control. Women and children suffered the consequences of pain that had no other outlet. And then there were the crimes of survival. People stole food, wood, linen, tools, anything they could trade for pennies. They were not criminals by nature, they were desperate, but the law was merciless. A hungry boy who stole a loaf of bread could be beaten, jailed, or sent halfway across the world to a penal colony. A man who stole a sheep to feed his family could be hanged. The justice system existed not to protect the poor, but to terrify them into obedience. Every day, rural Victorians woke up knowing that one small disaster, a broken tool, a failed crop, a sick animal, could mean starvation. There were no savings, no safety nets, no second chances. Poverty was a cliff, and everyone lived on the edge of it. Yet, even through this darkness, they continued. They prayed, they hoped, they worked, they tried. They shared what little they had with neighbors. A scrap of bread could be divided. A small fire could warm more than one child at a time. People who had nothing still helped each other because cruelty belonged to the wealthy, but kindness survived among the poor. Their strength was invisible, but it was immense. This world demanded everything from them: strength, dignity, health, life, and gave nothing back, but they refused to disappear. Through every storm, every famine, every winter, every loss, they stayed alive. That was their rebellion, that was their victory, and history would never fully understand what it cost them. There was one thing that silently shaped the misery of rural Victorian life more than hunger, more than disease, more than the endless labor, and that was ignorance. Not ignorance by choice, but by design. Education was a privilege the poor were never meant to have. Knowledge was power, and the powerful had no interest in sharing it. The rural poor were expected to know only enough to work, obey, suffer, and die. Anything more was seen as dangerous. Most children in the countryside never saw the inside of a school. Many did not even know what a school looked like. Instead of books, they held farming tools. Instead of lessons, they learned to sow, dig, gather, and obey. Their classroom was the field, their teacher was poverty, and their graduation was survival. Some villages were visited by traveling schoolmasters, poorly paid, often half-starved themselves, but even these small opportunities were not open to everyone. Parents could not afford to lose a child's labor for even a few hours. Education did not feed empty stomachs. A child who sat at a desk instead of working was a child who ate more than they earned. Starvation made the decision cruelly simple. The wealthy preached that education was wasted on the poor. Teaching them to read, to write, to think would only cause unrest. That was the word they used, unrest, meaning the poor might one day realize how unfair the world truly was. So knowledge became a locked door, and the key was only for those who already had everything else. Yet even in this darkness, some parents whispered a dangerous dream, the dream that their children might learn to read, that they might escape the endless cycle of misery, that they might have choices, hope, a different future. But hope was expensive, and education cost more than most families earned in a month. Books alone were already a luxury, and many families did not own a single one. A Bible, if they had it, was often the only printed object in the house, and many could not read even that. Some children learned to read secretly. They borrowed scraps of newspapers, broken pages from hymn books, or tattered pamphlets dropped in the road. They would hide behind barns, tracing letters with dirty fingers, whispering sounds under their breath. They learned slowly, stubbornly, unknowingly rebelling against a world that wanted them silent and uneducated. But these hidden lessons were rare and often short-lived. A child caught reading instead of working could be beaten, sent home, or fired. Even adults remained illiterate their entire lives. They signed documents with an X because they could not write their own names. They were easy to cheat. Landlords, merchants, and employers used contracts and papers full of lies, knowing the poor could not read them. Debts were invented, wages manipulated, rents raised. A man could lose everything because of a sentence he could not understand. Illiteracy was not just ignorance, it was vulnerability. When religious organizations finally established charity schools for the poor, they came with strings attached. Children learned to read just enough to understand the Bible, just enough to say prayers, just enough to be obedient subjects of the crown and church. They were taught morality with a sharp, unforgiving edge, that poverty was a punishment from God, that obedience was holy, that questioning authority was sin. Education, when offered, became another form of control. Still, not all teachers were cruel. Some saw the suffering of the poor and tried to help them rise. These teachers worked long hours for almost no pay, teaching in cold, damp rooms with leaking ceilings and broken floors. They taught children who arrived barefoot and shivering, children who fell asleep from exhaustion, children whose stomachs growled louder than their voices. And yet, those small moments of learning were like sparks in the dark. But sparks could not fight a storm. As the Industrial Revolution expanded, the countryside changed forever. Machines and factories swallowed jobs like hungry beasts. Hand labor was replaced by iron. Entire villages found themselves without work. Men who once plowed fields now stood in front of silent, empty barns. Women who spun yarn by hand were replaced by machines that worked faster and cheaper. The poor were told to adapt, but how does one adapt to a world that no longer needs them? Families were forced to migrate to industrial towns in search of work. They packed their few belongings, torn blankets, pots, a Bible, maybe a cracked cup, and left behind generations of memories. Some walked miles along dirt roads, sleeping in barns and ditches. Others piled into wagons, huddled together like cattle. Their journey was not toward promise, but toward uncertainty. But staying meant death, and moving meant a chance, even a small one. When they arrived in industrial towns, the shock was overwhelming. Smoke filled the sky. Factories towered like dark giants. Streets were crowded. loud, filthy. Houses stood packed together in endless rows, each one smaller and dirtier than the last. Instead of open fields, there were brick walls. Instead of fresh air, choking smog. Instead of daylight, a permanent gray shadow cast by chimneys that never slept. And the work was worse than anything they had known. Factories consumed workers like machines consumed coal. Hours stretched beyond imagination, 14, 16, 18 hours a day. The air was thick with dust and steam. Machines screamed and clanged. Floors were slick with oil and sweat. There were no safety guards, no protections. A hand caught in gears meant mutilation. A foot crushed by machinery meant amputation. But even injury offered no mercy. A crippled worker was a useless worker, and a useless worker starved. Children were sent into mills and factories because they were cheap, small, and expendable. They crawled under spinning gears to clean them while the machines were running. They inhaled cotton dust that coated their lungs. They pulled coal carts through dark tunnels so narrow that even an adult could not bend down far enough to enter. They were beaten if they slowed down. Sometimes they never came home. Mothers worked in textile mills, their arms raw from chemicals and steam. Their hair was cut short so it would not be torn into machinery. Their skin burned from fibers that embedded into pores. They fainted from heat, thirst, and exhaustion. Pregnant women worked until they collapsed, gave birth, and returned days later because poverty left no time for healing. The housing in these industrial towns was another curse. 10, sometimes 12 people slept in a single tiny room. Walls were damp, windows broken, floors rotting. Rats crawled across sleeping faces. Sewage ran through the streets. Bodies weakened by rural poverty were now destroyed by urban disease. Cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis swept through neighborhoods like silent assassins. And yet, even in this nightmare, the poor remained invisible to the world of wealth. The aristocrats and industrialists who profited from this suffering lived in grand houses, far from the pollution and filth. They spoke proudly of progress, innovation, and industry, never acknowledging the human cost. They saw workers as fuel, burned and replaced without regret. Some among the wealthy believed they were doing charity by employing the poor at all. They saw themselves as benevolent masters, providing opportunity to those who would otherwise starve. But opportunity without dignity is just another form of cruelty. Work without security is just slow starvation with steps, and wages that barely kept a person alive were not generosity, they were exploitation. The rural poor who migrated to cities did not find a better life. They found a different kind of misery. The countryside had been cruel, but it had space, air, silence. The cities offered none of that. People crowded into every block, every alley, every cellar. Drunken men staggered through streets. Children begged for coins. Women waited outside factories, hoping to be chosen for a day's labor. Crime spread, not because the poor were wicked, but because they were desperate. Hunger does not ask permission. It does not obey the law. It grows and it demands. People stole coal to stay warm. They stole bread to stay alive. They scavenged through garbage piles for scraps. And when they were caught, judges handed out punishments as if starvation were a personal insult to the empire. And all the while, politicians debated whether helping the poor would make them lazy. Newspapers printed stories warning that charity would spoil them. Voices of power argued that suffering was necessary, that poverty kept people disciplined. They designed laws to make life harder, not easier. They believed that if the poor were miserable enough, they would work harder. But misery does not build strong workers. It builds graves. In some places, reformers and activists tried to change things. They wrote books, gave speeches, exposed horrors, and demanded laws to protect workers. But change came slowly, resisted at every step by those who profited from exploitation. The rich argued that helping the poor would damage the economy, as if the economy were more alive than the people who fed it. Through all of this, rural Victorians carried a quiet, unspoken grief, the grief of being forgotten. Their stories were not written in history books. Their struggles were not carved into monuments. They did not leave diaries, letters, or memoirs. Many of them could not write their own names. They lived, suffered, and died in silence. And yet, without them, the Victorian era would not exist. They built the farms, they harvested the food, they dug the coal, they wove the cloth, they fueled the factories, they raised the cities. They kept the empire alive while the empire pretended not to see them. They were the spine of a nation that treated them like dirt. Most Victorians never saw real old age. To live past 40 was already a blessing, and to live beyond 50 was almost a miracle. People aged fast. Bodies broke early, teeth rotted, eyes dimmed, joints bent. By the time a rural Victorian reached 30, they often looked 50. Bones were damaged from constant hard work, malnutrition, and untreated diseases. And when those worn-down bodies could no longer labor, society simply discarded them. The village had no pension, no charity, no retirement. An older worker who couldn't farm anymore was just dead weight. In many households, the elderly were not respected but feared, because they were expensive to feed and useless to the work economy. The village saw them as mouths to feed, nothing else. Some families kept their elders indoors, wrapped in thin blankets, waiting for nature to take them quietly, so the family would not be accused of neglect. Others sent them out to beg on the roads, forcing them to collect pity, coins, or food scraps from travelers. Many simply died silently in back rooms. When the food ran out, their portions were cut first. A strong child might survive hunger, but a weak old woman or man, not for long. Death in some ways was relief. But even in death, there was humiliation. A poor Victorian could not afford a proper coffin. Funeral rites were short and cold, without flowers, without music, without prayers beyond the bare minimum. The grave was shallow, quickly dug, often shared with others. The wealthy buried their dead with marble stones and engraved words. The poor were buried with mud and silence. And most shocking of all, many rural Victorians were buried not because they died naturally, but because illness finished them while help was right outside their reach. Without doctors, without disinfectants, without real medicine, something small could kill easily. A cut from a rusty tool, a fever from dirty water, a winter cough that turned into slow suffocation. There was no hospital to run to. The nearest doctor might be miles away, and even if he arrived, he would probably charge more than a family earned in a month. So the sick stayed home. They lay in bed, sweating, shivering, coughing, begging for breath. Sometimes family sat with them, holding their hands. Other times they were left alone in the dark, waiting for death. Gaslighting and ignorance made it worse. Victorians believed in curses, demons, and punishments from God. If a child got sick, some parents thought it was because the child was sinful. If a woman got pneumonia, it was said she must have angered heaven. Medicine was mixed with superstition. Some families burned herbs to chase evil spirits. Others prayed for miracles instead of washing wounds or boiling water. Doctors were rare and distrusted, except by the wealthy. So disease ruled easily. Smallpox, cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, names that sound old and distant today, were terrifying, unstoppable forces back then. They tore through villages silently, killing one house at a time. People did not understand how infection worked. They shared cups, beds, and food, spreading sickness unknowingly. When someone died, families often washed the body, kissed the forehead, dressed the corpse, touching infected skin, breathing infected air. Hours later, the next person fell ill. Illness changed everything. It turned families into grave sites. It turned mothers into nurses, children into mourners, fathers into quiet statues, unable to save the ones they loved with bare hands and no knowledge. Sometimes the sick recovered slowly, often they didn't, and when the coughing stopped or the heartbeat faded, there was no doctor to confirm death. The family simply realized the body had grown still and cold. They covered the face with cloth, lit a candle, and prepared for burial. Grief was short because life demanded work immediately. Land needed to be plowed, animals needed feeding. Life didn't pause even for death. In winter, burial was even more brutal. The ground froze like solid rock. Families struggled with primitive shovels, hacking through ice and soil just to create a shallow pit. Some bodies lay wrapped in blankets for days, waiting for the earth to soften. Wolves and dogs sniffed around the outskirts of villages, drawn by the smell. Children watched from windows, frightened that the animals might dig the bodies up. Sometimes they did. Not every death happened quietly. Some people chose their own ending. It is a dark truth rarely spoken in history books. When poverty grew unbearable, when food vanished, when sickness tortured the body, some rural Victorians ended their suffering themselves. Records of it exist, hidden, whispered, avoided by polite society. Villagers found bodies in barns, forests, wells, and rivers. Families tried to hide it out of shame because the church taught that taking one's own life was a sin. But the harsh reality remained: when life is full of hunger, cold, pain, and fear, death can look like mercy. And while the poor lived short lives of desperation, a different world existed just a few miles away. The Victorian aristocracy enjoyed luxury so large that it almost feels insulting. They wore silk, velvet, and gold. Their homes had fireplaces, warm beds, servants, meat, medicine, entertainment, clean water, education, doctors, and longer lives. They lived like royalty while peasants lived like trapped animals. A wealthy Victorian could expect to live into their 60s or 70s. A poor farmer was lucky to reach 40. 2 worlds in one country, one drowning, one feasting. Male poverty was deadly, but female poverty was torture. Victorian society considered men the workers and women the dependents. But when a husband died or abandoned the family, the wife lost not only love, but survival. No money, no property rights, no legal power, no way to earn. Many widows lived on the edge of starvation. Some begged, some took in laundry for pennies, some worked as servants until their backs broke. Others ended up in poorhouses, buildings where the desperate traded freedom for food. These places were prisons disguised as charity. Families were separated. Children lived in different rooms from parents. Everyone worked endless hours for a tiny bowl of food and a cold cot. The workhouse was feared more than hunger itself. People said, better to die free than live in there. Women who had no options sometimes turned to prostitution. Not because they wanted to, but because survival demanded it. A loaf of bread, a few coins, a warm place to sleep, that was the price. Many died of disease, abuse, or violence before they ever reached middle age. No history textbook tells these stories in full, but they happened everywhere, in every town, in every winter. Childhood was supposed to be full of innocence, laughter, learning. In Victorian villages, childhood was labor. Children worked from the moment they could walk, feeding animals, carrying water, collecting firewood, weeding fields, cleaning, sewing, cooking. Girls learned to care for babies at age 7. Boys learned to plow fields at 8. If a child complained, they were beaten. If they cried, they were told to be silent. Every tear was wasted energy. Many children died before age 5. They died from diarrhea caused by dirty water, from infection after a simple cut, from fever, from cold, from hunger. When a baby died, mothers cried silently, but life didn't stop. Another child needed feeding, laundry needed washing, the pain stayed inside. There were no toys, no school books, no vacations. Christmas meant maybe one orange if the family could afford it. When the church bell rang, Even children prayed for food and warmth, not toys or fun. Their dreams were tiny. They did not imagine a big future. They just hoped to see the next morning. And yet, despite all of this, the Victorian poor kept going. They worked in rain, frost, mud, and blistering sun. They raised children in impossible conditions. They laughed sometimes, even if it was rare. They told stories by candlelight, sang songs to forget the hunger, prayed for better days. Some found joy in small things: a fresh loaf of bread, shoes without holes, a night without coughing, a warm fire that lasted until morning. Little victories gave them strength to face cruel days, but the world did not care about them. The government ignored them, the aristocracy used them, the church lectured them. They lived, suffered, and died mostly unnoticed. History remembers the inventions, the railways, the factories, the grand mansions, the wealthy Victorian gentlemen in fine suits, and the ladies in elegant dresses. But the truth is that those grand achievements were paid for by the broken hands and empty stomachs of the poor. If we could travel back in time and walk through a Victorian village, we would not smell flowers or see beauty. We would smell sewage, rot, animal waste, sweat, sickness, and smoke. We would hear coughing, crying babies, and desperate prayers. We would see children with hollow cheeks, women with bruised hands, men with cracked